all still queued up. I queued it up earlier. Hopefully it's going to work for us. This is Dr. Cornel West from, I think he's from Princeton. He was at Harvard or Princeton. He was at one of these Ivy League schools. It's kind of a funny story. He released a hip-hop album while he was a chair and heavy-duty, heavy-hitting professor at an Ivy League school. And president of his university basically was going to fire him for putting out a hip-hop album. And because he's such a preeminent African-American scholar, and because in his field he's kind of like a prize, and so he just went over, he just jumped from one Ivy League school to the other. He just switched teams, be kind of like being a free agent, So of the academic business, this guy's a pretty hard hitter, and he just went over to another one of the schools. But I mentioned before on Monday that he was starred in the Matrix movies, or he was at a bit part in the Matrix movies, and he's a big media. He's a face really of black studies really as a field, and along with a few others, like I mentioned Michael Eric Dyson and Henry Louis Gates. But I think Dr. West is probably the preeminent black studies scholar in America today, and he fashions himself as a public intellectual, meaning he's not speaking in the classroom, but he's speaking out, on the public square, on TV, in the streets, and so on. And this is a interview on National Public Radio with Tavis Smiley, who hosts a radio program, and he's interviewing Cornel West about the true definition of the blues.
From NPR in Los Angeles, I'm Tavis Smiley. The blues is said to be a phrase that best describes the African-American sensibility and outlook on the world. However, African-American influence on the country as a whole has, in some ways, made the blues a national characteristic, one that coincides with the ideals of democracy. Indeed, some suggest that democracy and the blues are the most enduring U.S. exports. Our regular commentator, Cornel West, subscribes to that point of view and joins us now to talk about the relevance of the blues in our time, its relationship to democracy, and the wisdom of the people who created it. Cornel, it's always nice to talk to you.
Always a blessing, my brother.
This conversation about the blues is always fascinating to me because there's so many different definitions, a myriad list of definitions of what the blues is. What's yours?
I think the blues is a tragic comic hope. It's a way of facing darkness and still smiling, of looking unflinchingly at despair and still enduring. I think that Leroy Jones's great classic, 40 years old now, Blues People, along with Ralph Ellison and James Baldwin and others, have made it very clear that the blues is not in any way just a possession of black people. It's a human response to adverse circumstances that accents humanity, creativity, a certain sense of levity, but it understands the gravity of what we're up against.
So the blues then is not just a kind of musical expression.
Not at all. It's a philosophic disposition toward the world. The greatest literary artist of the modern world is Anton Chekhov. He is a blues artist. You see the blues sensibility in giants like William Faulkner, Eugene O'Neill, Tennessee Williams, Toni Morrison. The blues is an idiom of the 20th century.
What does the blues then have to do with democracy? Where's the parallel here?
Well, one, of course, the blues was created by those who Sly Stone calls everyday people, and it shows the depth of their wrestling with dark circumstances, and it accents voice, lifts every voice, a voice that shapes the destiny of a people, of a nation, in the end, of humanity. So it's critique, it's resistance, it's accenting humanity, and it's a hope against hope. There's no optimism in the blues, nor is there pessimism in the blues. It is a mature hope, an earned hope, a blood-soaked, tear-stained hope.
How does the blues, you think, Cornel, sum up the wisdom of black people in particular?
I think black people are people who are on intimate terms with forms of death, slavery, social death, Jim Crow, civic death, self-hatred, spiritual death. In a civilization that denies death, America is the land of not just liberty, opportunity, and possibility for many people. It's also the land that has no past and is preoccupied with making the future better than the present. Whereas black folk have had to be locked into death grips. And when you're in a death grip, you don't have a Disney World sensibility or Peter Pan mentality. You have a mature wrestling with reality, history, and mortality.
That's black folk in the blues. Let me get to white folk in the blues in a moment. But first, I wonder whether or not you think the characteristics that you just spoke of with regard to African Americans are relevant to Africans in the diaspora. Do they have the same sensibilities as you see it?
I think the difference is black people in the United States are an African people, but we're New World Africans. And to be New World is to put that stress on individuality. To be on the continent of Africa is put the stress on community, in which individuality is not as accented or developed.
Let's shift now to the blues and white folk. As you know, Cornell, director Martin Scorsese has produced a documentary series looking at the blues. Let me ask, in that context, how much has the blues, you think, become a characteristic shared by white Americans and others, for that matter?
Well, I think the more wise and discerning white fellow citizens, I've mentioned Thomas Pynchon. We could talk about Mark Twain. We could talk about Philip Roth. There's a number of fellow white citizens who have a tragicomic sensibility. There's no doubt about that. And they learned much from the blues. But I think for the mainstream white America, the blues remains a kind of exotic source of amusement, a kind of primitivistic occasion for entertainment. And they don't recognize that the blues is not simply a music to titillate, but it's actually a way of life to unsettle and unnerve them.
Finally, Cornell, as evidenced by, one, this conversation, not to mention Scorsese's documentary series looking at the blues, why, from your perspective, is the blues still relevant today?
Well, I think it's relevant because when you look down through the courses of time, you go back to the Greek invention of the Socratic, you go back to the Jewish invention of the prophetic, that the black American invention of the blues is actually going to have effect down through the centuries, because the tragicomic hope is in fact the only kind of hope that has any kind of maturity in a world of overwhelming barbarity and bestiality, not just in the form of terrorism, but in the form of the emptiness of our lives, in terms of the wasted potential that we see around the world. And so in that sense, the blues is here to stay, and it is a distinctive, it's a great contribution of black people to world history.
Just a reminder that you can meet commentators Cornell West, Michael Eric Dyson, and yours truly during our Pass the Mic tour, coming to a city near you this December. To find out how to join us on the road, we'd love to see you. Visit Tavitt.
I actually have the Ralph Ellison definition, a couple places written down, actually. Ralph Ellison wrote, "The blues is an impulse to keep the painful details and episodes of a brutal experience alive in one's aching consciousness, to finger its jagged grain and to transcend it, not by the consolation of philosophy, by squeezing from it a near-tragic, near-comic lyricism." Okay? And so what I'm arguing here is that we want to do, rather than to dwell on the purely negative and tragic nature of the crime against humanity that was slavery, focus instead on what grew out, what rose from the ashes of that tragedy is a musical and cultural tradition that is beautiful, that is full of humor and laughter and lyricism and poetry and art, and that what the tension that Dr. West was talking about, and that we always have to keep in mind, is that tension between just consuming it as entertainment, okay, versus understanding the reality from which it emerges. Okay, I'm sure you all have seen, at least once in your life here living in Tennessee, a white kid who wants to be gangsta and who has the whole mannerism and the entire, dialect and performs. No, no. That is, but doesn't understand about where it comes from, and so there's this sensibility of keeping things real that you have to be able to have, paid your ticket, have got your ticket stamped on that train at some point, that you have got to have walked in those shoes before you can claim that identity. And I think what you have is a problem with some folks. Some of our, as Dr. West calls us, fellow white citizens, some of us have never been there, and so we can't claim that. But if you've been there, I think what he's saying, and you can speak to it, you can claim that. I'm going to talk about the book.